All right, hello, welcome back, everybody. PayPal and Patreon are down below if you want to support me. Only do so if you actually can. So, since we're at the end of another year and the composition of our power generation, both worldwide and from one country to another, changes with every passing year, we're going to go ahead and take a look at what the current composition is, both for global electricity generation and also the individual breakdowns for some countries, major consumers, and a few collective regions. So, starting off, obviously, with the world as a whole. Coal is obviously still the predominant source of power generation, although the margin by which it is has been gradually decreasing in turn with natural gas taking up a larger and larger role. But currently, the global electricity generation mix by source is 35% coal fired power plants, 23% natural gas fired power plants, 15% hydropower dams, 9.5% nuclear power, 7.5% wind power, 4.5% solar power, 2.5% oil fired power plants, and then the remainder falling under the broad umbrella of other. Then moving out from that and taking a look at some individual countries and regions. In the US, you now see basically the exact inversion of what one of the arrangements was about 20 years ago, where it was 40% coal and 20% natural gas. Now, 20 years on from that, it's actually directly flipped, with 40% of US power generation being from natural gas fired power plants and 20% coming from coal fired power plants, with a further 18% coming from nuclear plants, about 10% as of last year being generated by wind turbines, 6% coming from hydropower dams, 3% from solar, a bit under 0.5% coming from geothermal, and then the remainder after all of that coming from the infamous other. China, now the world's largest electricity consumer, was also intending to switch a lot of their power generation over to natural gas fired power plants. However, that has not worked out the way they wanted, as 15 years ago or so, they were anticipating on following behind the US, since they also have a large amount of natural gas shale in China. However, that hasn't panned out as they would have hoped, because it turns out the shale formations in China don't have the same volumetric density or concentration as many of those in the US do. So the amount of gas that they're able to actually get out of fracking their formations is not as high as they would have liked. So coal remains their overwhelming majority power generation source, coming in at 61% coal-fired power plants, followed by hydro as the next largest source, but only down to 15%, wind following at 8%, solar at 4%, natural gas at only 3%, nuclear on its way from 2 up to 2.5%, and then the remaining percentage after that being other. Next up, the world's third largest electricity consumer, India. India is still predominantly coal, coming in at 74%, followed by hydropower at 10%, wind power 5%, solar 6%, actually coming in higher than China in terms of percent generated from nuclear power at 2.5%, and then natural gas also coming in at 2.5%. Europe collectively, and yes, I am doing you guys collectively as a region. Don't worry, you'll live. Africa already gets lumped together as a giant collective region so often, along with all of Latin America outside of Mexico and Brazil. So don't worry, Europe, you'll survive for 1 year. Europe collectively as a region has a much more even split amongst everything than most other countries or regions. Natural gas is now their predominant source of power generation, though only by a slim margin, providing 20% of their electricity. That would have actually been nuclear power were it not for Germany constantly making very regrettable decisions. With Germany now having shut down all of its nuclear plants, nuclear power now is down to comprising 18.5% of Europe's power generation. And then coming in right below nuclear is wind, with most of that generation coming from the corridor between the North Sea and Baltic Sea, and also within the North Sea itself. Coal follows thereafter at 15%. Hydropower follows that then at 14%. Solar coming in at 11%. Oil-fired power plants coming in at 1.5%. And then other, some chunk of which is Sweden burning garbage. Russia, the world's fourth largest electricity consumer on an individual country basis, has its power production predominantly featuring natural gas, as you could expect, probably. Natural gas making up close to half, coming in at 46%, followed by nuclear at 19%, hydropower at 17%, then coal just below that at 16.5%, then followed by everything else in minuscule amounts. Oil-fired power plants at 0.5%, wind power at 0.5%, and everything else together after that also at 0.5%. Then just behind Russia in terms of usual electricity demand numbers, Japan comes in as the fifth largest consumer in the world, and for them, coal and gas are right about next to each other, with coal edging out gas, natural gas about 28%, both of them slipping down over the last 3 years or so, as Japan has been making better decisions than Germany and has been reactivating their various nuclear plants, with nuclear back up to providing 11% of their electricity now. And once all of their reactors are switched back on, nuclear will be up to providing between 30 and 35%. Nuclear is followed thereafter by solar at about 10%, hydro dams at about 7.5%, oil-fired power plants at about 4%, wind power at 1%, some geothermal coming in under 0.5%, and then all the rest of their energy mix falls under other. And right across the water from them, South Korea has a pretty even triple split mix, with coal coming in the most predominant at 35% of their power generation, and then natural gas and nuclear power both following that with 29% each. The next highest source being solar power at 3.5%, and then a bunch of 0.5% following that. 0.5% hydro, 0.5% oil-fired power plants, 0.5% wind, and other. Then down southward around the equator, Indonesia is still predominantly fueled by coal. However, they will likely be switching over to better chunks of natural gas as their natural gas production begins increasing, and geothermal Indonesia is in the process of expanding further into constructing additional geothermal plants as they have plenty of capacity. So their current power generation mix is as follows: 62% coal, 17% natural gas, 8% hydropower dams, 7% geothermal, 0.5% solar, 0.5% wind, and 2% oil-fired power plants. Brazil is the global big one when it comes to hydropower, with hydropower dams comprising 63% of their power generation. Brazil's further power generation mix breaks down as 11% wind power as of last year, 6% natural gas-fired power generation, solar 2.5%, coal 2.5%, 2% nuclear, although Brazil is intending to expand that. I forget whether it was them or Argentina who is already in the process of constructing one or two additional reactors. I believe it's Brazil that is already constructing the additional reactors. 1% coming from oil-fired power plants, and 12% coming from other, which in Brazil's case, I would assume a fair amount is probably from smaller localized plants burning agricultural waste, and also a lot of smaller generation from small and medium scale diesel generators out in the middle of nowhere. Mexico is predominantly natural gas by more than half, 56% of their power generation. Hydropower gives them 10.5%. 10% of theirs does come from oil-fired power plants, 9% from wind power, 6.5% from coal, 5% from solar, and 3% from nuclear. So for the rest of Latin America, all of Central America and South America, excluding Mexico and Brazil, are dominated by hydropower, with hydropower coming in at 43.5% for the remainder of the region, natural gas coming in at 26.5%, oil-fired power plants coming in at 11%, solar coming in at 6.5%, wind power coming in right behind it at 6%, coal coming in at 5.5%, nuclear at 1%, at 1% for the remainder of the region being in Argentina. And then for Africa, as the entire continent, natural gas is the predominant source today, coming in at 40.5% of the continent's power generation. Coal obviously comes in second then at 26.5. Hydro is now comprising 17.5%, and that should be climbing a bit more as Mozambique completes a number of new high capacity dams in the next few years. Oil fired power plants then follow at 5.5%, wind power then at 5%, solar power at 2.5%, solar thermal projects, predominantly in South Africa and Morocco, geothermal, predominantly in Kenya and Ethiopia, provides 1%, and then obviously all of the rest falls under other. And then for the last one this time, Saudi Arabia is now predominantly generating its electricity from natural gas-fired power plants, with 2/3 or 67% from natural gas, and 1/3 still coming from oil-fired power plants, although they are switching the two out, and thus decreasing oil-fired power generation by 7% each year. So theoretically, if they continue following the same rate and trend, they should no longer be utilizing oil-fired power generation within the next 5 or 6 years or so. But that's it for this one then. So thank you everybody for sticking around and listening. Like if you enjoyed, subscribe if you haven't already. PayPal and Patreon are down there if you want to support me. Only do so if you actually can. All the usual links to the different Google Docs are in the description with all kinds of different energy, resource, demographic, data compilations that I prepared for you guys. So you can always look at all the kinds of stuff you would want to see. A link to my catch channels in the top pinned comment as always. And may God bless and protect you. I will see you all around next time.